It all started when I opened my Snapchat account to share a little of what was going on behind the scenes of my life as a model. I must say it was really fun and helped me connect in a more direct way with my followers. That's how I met Mike, one of my most loyal fans. At first, his messages were like anyone else's. A lot of compliments and questions about my work and blah blah blah. But I liked interacting so much that I never hesitated to answer him. Plus, he was quite handsome. But then I started noticing that things were changing. First, it was something subtle. He started sending me pictures of him with makeup and hairstyles that somehow looked quite similar to mine. And this was, let's say, interesting. And at first I laughed and took it as a compliment. But then every time he wrote me, it was getting weirder and weirder. One night, I remember I uploaded a photo from a night shoot looking vintage and looking melancholy. And the next day, Mike sent me a selfie posing the same way, only he was wearing a mask that was an almost exact copy of my face. "Isn't it like looking in a mirror?" he wrote to me. I tried to take it as a joke and replied something like, "Wow, that looks really elaborate. Where did you get that idea?" But I got chills when he replied that he had done it himself so that, and I quote, "we could always be together, as if we were one." At that point, I knew I had to cut off contact with him. This was not only getting out of hand, but it was very disturbing, so I stopped answering his messages and started ignoring him a bit. I was hoping he would get the hint, but Mike didn't like that at all. On the contrary, he became more insistent and started sending me weird and, frankly, disturbing messages, like pictures of him in places where I had been before, but not like places where he had photographed me, but places like the supermarket or the mall. This was really strange and gave me the creeps. But things escalated to a higher level when one night I received a timestamp selfie from Mike, and it was a picture taken from outside my apartment, as if I had taken it from a car parked in front of my building. The message read, "I can't sleep knowing you're right across the street." That was the straw that broke the camel's back. I felt completely terrified and immediately blocked it. My heart was beating like crazy, as if it wanted to open a hole in my chest. But that was not all. On the contrary, this was just beginning. The next day I found a package at the door of my apartment, and when I opened it I found a mask, but this time a replica of his face, and a note that said, "Use this, and we will be together forever." I froze. My hands started shaking, and I knew I had to do something immediately. So I went to the police, but they told me that since there were no direct threats, they couldn't do much. I felt frustrated and terrified. What do you mean they couldn't do anything? Something had to be done, but no. And now I was lost. I had no idea how to handle what was going on. A couple of days passed with no news, but one night, while I was trying to distract myself with a movie, I received an email from a new account, and as soon as I read it, I recognized Mike's style immediately. The letter read, "You can block me, but we are meant to be together. Why don't you understand, silly? I love you, I adore you, and we'll be together soon, honey." This sent a wave of chills throughout my body, and it only got worse from there. For the next few days, I lived in permanent paranoia. After that distressing email, I felt like Mike was everywhere, like a shadow following me around, turning my home, which used to be my refuge, into a glass prison. Every noise made me jump with fear, and my poor heart spent the whole day racing. I couldn't stand my paranoia any longer and decided to take action. I installed additional locks on the door and windows and security cameras throughout the apartment and at the entrance of the building, but the idea of Mike being out there waiting for me filled me with equal dread, and the worst thing was that unfortunately, the police patrols that passed by every now and then offered me no comfort at all. Mike was like a shadow that moved at night without me noticing him. It was frightening, and sometimes I felt like he could be anywhere. Once, I decided to go to a coffee shop to get some work done. I was in a corner of the place trying to go unnoticed, when suddenly I saw him. He was staying in a far corner, but his eyes wouldn't leave me. As soon as I noticed him, I slammed my laptop shut and almost ran for the exit. I jumped into my car and left the place immediately. At that moment, I realized that Mike was more obsessed with me than I thought, and it gave me goosebumps. I remember one night I was at a club with a friend, enjoying myself and dancing, maybe a little closer than would make me feel comfortable, when out of nowhere Mike came out of the shadows like a ghost, and without a word, pounced on my friend and started beating him up. It was a total mess. The bouncers had to intervene and forcibly remove him from there, while my friend was still dazed and his face was a mess from the blows. But the scariest thing of all is that while I was pushing him out, Mike didn't say anything. He just looked at me in a creepy way, something that made me feel horrible. From then on, the idea of going out, even for things as simple as grocery shopping, became a monumentally uncomfortable task for me. I didn't know what to expect. I was always thinking he could show up at any moment, until the night came that pushed me over the edge. I remember everything was tense, as if the air was charged with a dense energy, which was surely a reflection of all the chaos that had taken over me. I was trying to catch up with my emails, trying almost desperately to get my life back to normal, when suddenly a notification popped up on my phone. It was a message from a user I didn't know. And yes, of course it crossed my mind that it could be Mike again, but curiosity got the better of me anyway. So I opened the picture, but what I saw chilled my blood. It was a picture of the entrance to my building taken from across the street, and the caption read, "There's a storm coming, Tiffany. Let's face it together." As you might imagine, panic took hold of me immediately, so I ran to the balcony, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of it. Then I heard a sound, as if someone was trying to scale the building. My heart skipped a beat and my heartbeat was so fast I felt like it was going to burst out of my mouth, and as I tried to regain my composure, I watched in horror as Mike appeared at the edge, completely drenched, wearing the mask he had made out of my face, but now with a twisted smile on it that made me feel sick. "Hey baby, you can't hide from me tonight. From today, we'll be together," he said in a calm voice, as if he was talking to his girlfriend, as if this whole situation wasn't completely crazy. My mind was at war at that moment. Terror and fury were fighting to control my body. "Get away from me, Mike!" I yelled loudly, trying to sound more assertive than I really felt. "I'm going to call the police if you take one more step," I warned him, but he only started laughing loudly and his laughter terrified me even more. "We're way past the police now, Tiff. It's just you and me in this little world. No one can separate us." At that moment, I felt I couldn't waste any more time. Not only did I want to get out of there, but I decided to record it. I don't even know how that idea came to me, but I felt that if I couldn't escape, I at least wanted to have evidence so the police could catch him. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, trying to get an answer that would give me some clarity. "Because you're brainless and you just don't know it," he said, taking a step closer. Instinctively, I took a step back, but suddenly, everything came flooding down as it started pouring rain. At that moment, using the storm as a distraction, I made a quick and practically mindless decision. I jumped inside the apartment, quickly closing the sliding door and leaving the demented Mike on the other side. Upon realization, he threw himself against the glass, thrashing and screaming, water sliding down his grotesque mask, and an unbridled fury that was palpable in his voice. Keeping the camera focused on him, I recorded every moment of that terrifying madness, and as I did, I dialed 911 with shaking hands and trying to get my voice above the roar of thunder and Mike's screams, then shouted my address to the operator and told her there was a madman trying to kill me and I needed the could. She told me they were on their way, and at that moment, just as quickly as he had appeared, Mike disappeared into the storm, vanishing into the darkness. An hour later, the police found him. He was hiding in the shadows just a block from my building. He was soaking wet and barely able to walk, as it seems he had broken his ankle when he jumped off my balcony. Karma, I call it. It turns out that the video I recorded went viral and had a lot of supportive comments from my followers, but most of all, this served as evidence in the trial. This trial against Mike was quick, as the evidence was irrefutable, and, as I watched everything, I could feel a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was a step toward getting my life back, leaving this terrifying episode behind me. Eventually, I began to speak out about the dangers of online harassment, using my platform to help others who had been in similar situations. I had survived Mike's madness, but I knew that the fight against this kind of darkness was not yet over. My story had become a warning in the fight for safety and the need to look out for one another in this digital age. I felt I now had a mission to protect others from falling into the nightmare I had gone through. My sister, Cynthia, disappeared 4 years ago. Her disappearance was one of those unexplainable things that happen that no one is able to foresee. Cynthia didn't leave any letters or anything like that, and she didn't seem to be going through a bad time either. She was just a normal girl going to high school and living her life like any other. So no one expected this. The day she left, we were all having dinner together, joking and talking about trivial things as usual. Who could have imagined that this would be our last dinner together? The next morning, when we noticed he wasn't home, we called all his friends, but no one knew anything. So we went into his room and, apart from a suitcase and a couple of clothes, everything seemed the same, completely normal. One day she was home, and the next she was gone. We reported her disappearance to the police, but since Cynthia had already turned 18, they didn't do much for us. I don't know if that has changed, but by that time, a person wasn't reported missing for 72 hours, especially if they were an adult, and since there was no sign that anything was wrong either, they basically washed their hands of it. However, a few days later a search party was organized, but unfortunately we couldn't find my sister. I missed her a lot, and my parents almost went crazy about it, especially my mother. But as the years went by, life went on, and at least for me, I started to think less about her, but I always kept her in my mind. But as the years went by, we resigned ourselves to the fact that my sister was no longer in this world, so we only held in our hearts the hope that one day we could find her remains to give her a decent funeral and at least have some closure. However, last week, while scrolling through Instagram, I suddenly saw it again. It was a promotional ad for a dance studio called Soul Dance Studio that I had never seen before. The ad only had a title and a video of Cynthia dancing in front of a black background. Her hair was longer, and although she looked more mature, it was definitely her. I would recognize my sister in a crowd. I was drinking an iced coffee at the time and almost spit it out on my cell phone screen in shock. She was doing some amazing ballet moves, but her face was totally empty, emotionless, like she was dead inside. Nothing to do with the Cynthia I knew, the one who never stopped laughing and making jokes when she lived with us. My mom always called her little ray of sunshine, but the girl in the video was completely different. I watched that video several times, and each time trying to process what I was seeing and feeling my heart clench. I mean, to me and my family, my sister was 4 years deceased, and to see her now in this video, alive, was something I almost couldn't believe. But the more I replayed the video, the more I was haunted by her expression. When I finally came out of my shock, I decided to click on the ad, which took me to the Soul Studio website. However, there was no relevant information, just an endless list of videos of girls dancing on the same black background. They were all different, but did the exact same steps, and after scrolling through dozens of thumbnails, I got to the bottom of the site and found a contact link. Of course, I clicked on it right away, but it only took me back to her Instagram account. At that point, I knew I should let my parents know, but they were still on vacation in Hawaii and I couldn't wait, so I followed the account and messaged them, "Hi, where's your location?" but never got a response. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to tell them? That my sister had run away and was now dancing in a studio? There didn't seem to be any law to uphold. Nevertheless, I had a bad feeling about that place, but I couldn't explain it to the police, so I decided to wait. I wanted to at least have more information before my parents returned, so I tried to Google Studio Soul, but only the Instagram account and their video website came up. I was so desperate, I felt like every second counted, and it seemed like there was no way to find that damn studio. But on the other hand, the idea that my sister could be sitting pretty, dancing for a studio like it was nothing, while I was trapped in this uncertainty, after our family lived through 4 years of hell believing her dead, made me so angry. I couldn't help thinking that maybe she had found her place in the world and was happy without thinking about us. But on the other hand, this studio didn't look good to me. There was something strange in the air, a dark feeling that I couldn't shake. The waiting was getting more and more suffocating, but still, I decided that the best thing to do was to stay alert and wait for my parents to return so that together we could investigate. A few days passed and Saul's studio seemed to have disappeared. Every time I opened Instagram, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that was almost suffocating. Would there be any new videos from Cynthia? Maybe I would finally get some clue as to her whereabouts. Studio Saul uploaded a couple more videos, but none of the clips showed my sister. They were always different girls doing the same dance moves. But everything changed on the last Friday before my parents returned. That day I opened Instagram, and instead of a video, there was a picture of an old warehouse, and the caption said they were holding dance auditions that very day. The place looked awful, very run down and not at all suitable for anything serious, let alone a ballet studio. You could even see in the background a barbed wire fence surrounding the building, and even this one looked like it had seen better days. The address was 434 Lake Street, with hours from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Immediately, a dark and strange feeling invaded my body. This didn't feel right, but at least I now had an address. I knew I had to go there. This was my chance to find out what had happened to Cynthia, so I had to face my fear. I called my friend Ellie and told her everything I had found out, and luckily she wasn't as scared as I was. On the contrary, she was really excited and said she would pick me up so I wouldn't go alone. She just had to change her clothes first. I explained that we weren't really going to audition, but she insisted that we didn't know what we would find, so it didn't hurt to be ready. Ellie got home at 2 o'clock, and by 2:30 we were on our way to the warehouse. The place was pretty seedy, surrounded by abandoned buildings and rusty railroad tracks, and when we arrived there was only one car parked. I started to hesitate immediately. "I don't like this," I said, Ellie, but she grabbed my hand and squeezed it. "It's going to be all right. We're doing this for Cynthia, okay?" That motivated me, and I nodded. My friend's words gave me the push I needed to get out of the car, but my nerves were still on edge. We walked to the barbed wire gate and I knocked on the old rusty door, but no one came out. So we waited for a while until, finally, the door opened, but there was no one on the other side, and everything inside looked really scary. For the first time, I noticed that Ellie was as nervous as I was, which made me feel a little better in a way. Then, from the darkness inside, a man's voice called out, "Are you here for the audition?" At that moment, every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a sort of infinite pit in my stomach. Noticing my nervousness, Ellie squeezed my hand and whispered in my ear, "I think we should call the police." I couldn't agree more, so I nodded, and as that voice sounded with an accent I couldn't quite identify, I pulled out my phone. I walked away from the door as she stayed where she was, smiling nervously. Once far enough away to not be heard, I dialed 911 and told the operator where we were and explained that nothing was happening, but we needed help. The guy seemed a little confused, but said he would send an officer. When I hung up, I glanced toward the door and saw that it was now locked, and there was no sign of Ellie. "Ellie!" I yelled, but got no response. At that point, I began to panic in earnest. I ran to the door and banged loudly with my fist. "Open the door, Ellie!" I yelled in desperation, and with my heart racing, that's when I heard a click on the lock, and again the man's voice. "Thank you, but the auditions were over long ago." I was about to have a panic attack, but just at that instant, a police car appeared in the parking lot, and that gave me back some hope. I explained everything to the officer, although my words came out in a jumble, but despite the mess, he understood that my friend had disappeared inside the warehouse, so without much delay, he took out his gun and rushed towards the door, ready to kick it open. But it wasn't necessary because the door opened by itself, and immediately the policeman came in giving a stop voice. A few minutes passed and I couldn't hear anything until I saw the policeman come out alone, and that left me intrigued. Then he came up to me and told me that there was no one there. "I'm very sorry, miss, there is no one. In fact, it looks like there hasn't been anyone there in years." "No way," I said, almost shouting at him. "My friend just went in there. There was a man there too." But the officer shook his head and told me that if I wanted, we could corroborate. So I did. I went in with him, and it was true. The place was just an old shed, completely empty, and it didn't look like there had been anyone there. It was completely crazy. 2 days passed after that afternoon, and the police searched the whole area, but they found no trace of anyone. It was as if the place had never had any life in it. I showed the Instagram videos, but Saul Studio had deleted their account, and the officers said they would do a digital investigation to see who they were, but I haven't heard from them since. My parents came back yesterday and have been trying to comfort me and at the same time process everything I had told them, but it's just too overwhelming and overall weird. I wish I could be strong and not lose hope, but deep down inside, I feel like Ellie and Cynthia are gone forever, and every few minutes I grab my phone and open Instagram, silently begging to see a video of either of them, just to make sure they're still alive. Hi, I'm Adam, and the story I'm about to tell you happened in 2006, when Facebook was just starting to take off. Back then, I was in college, and of course, I had my account. Like all students, we used it to get organized for parties, share photos, and catch up on what was going on around campus, and all was going well until the day Arthur was murdered in a gruesome and mysterious way in his dorm room. The weirdest thing of all was that his Facebook profile picture was changed to a creepy image of him smiling in a devilish way. Arthur was a fourth-year student, and his death shocked everyone on campus. Someone had slit his throat and left him to bleed to death, and then uploaded a creepy profile picture to his Facebook, in which he was seen with a devilish grin. At that time, Photoshop was not so common, and only a few had it, like some who worked in the university magazine and professional photographers, but it was not something that people used as commonly as now, so this reduced a little the search margin. That's why, although they called a good group of students and professors to testify, they focused more on those who were in the area of design, communication, and technology, but after days of interrogations, they did not get clues about who had killed him. Some time passed and things started to calm down, but then another tragedy happened. The body of Diana, a third-year student, was found in one of the girls' restrooms with a neck wound exactly like Arthur's, and again, her profile picture was changed to a disturbing smiling image. The police were totally baffled. 2 murders in such a short time, with the same modus operandi and still without even a suspect. What a headache. But one thing did seem clear. They were dealing with a serial killer, and as you might imagine, everyone at the university was terrified, knowing that this killer was on the loose, and anyone could be his next victim. At the time, I was rooming with my friend Said, and even though we were already in our senior year, the situation scared the hell out of us. We would always accompany each other when going anywhere, and we would check the room several times a day to make sure everything was okay. The tension at the university was so thick that you could cut it with a knife, even if it was dull. Because of this situation, they installed a new security protocol and warned everyone to avoid being alone on campus. However, almost a month later, the unthinkable happened. Tim, a roommate, was murdered in the library, and that death shattered our calm completely. So, in view of the fact that their attempts to catch the killer had been completely futile, and roommates were still dying, we demanded from the campus authorities that we be allowed to at least do something to defend ourselves. So from then on, we were all allowed to carry things like pocket knives and pepper spray in our purses and pockets. The police were increasingly puzzled, and when they checked Tim's Facebook account, they saw that once again his profile picture was changed to a creepy image. Up until that point, the only connection between these students was that they were all at the same university and had Facebook accounts. When the news became public, people started deleting their profiles as a precaution, and Said and I also decided to do the same. However, just 2 days after Tim's death, another student named Clarissa was killed. She had not deleted her account, so her profile picture was also changed to the disturbing image of her smiling creepily. After that last murder, the university authorities decided to close the semester and send the students home until they caught the killer. A rather sensible decision under the circumstances. That same day, Saeed and I were packing to get out of there as soon as possible, anxious to get away from all this madness. But suddenly we heard a faint knock in our room. Then we realized that we hadn't checked the place because we were too excited to go home. I just wanted to run out of there right then and there, but Saeed decided to head for the closet where he thought the noise was coming from. But at that moment, the door opened and a hooded person appeared, but before we could react, Saeed was stabbed in the neck. At that moment, I froze, because I was sure he would kill me too. But after stabbing my friend, the stranger dropped the knife and approached me, handing me a note before quietly escaping through the same door he came in. I opened the note and it read, "I had my revenge. Now you know why I killed these students. Go to Facebook." I was in shock for a few seconds, still unable to process what had happened, but when reality finally rained down on me, I left the room screaming and crying in despair over the loss of my best friend, something that scarred me deeply. Immediately, the authorities were notified and sealed our dorm as a crime scene. Then I handed the note to an officer and the cyber team managed to access the Facebook account I mentioned, and what they discovered was beyond terrifying. It turns out that the 4 murdered students had been part of a Facebook group that was dedicated to harassing others, especially those who came from low-income backgrounds. Knowing that completely chilled me. Honestly, I never thought Saeed would be part of something like that, as he was always someone who helped others. He and the other 3, however, were taunting others and taking advantage of them behind closed doors. Thanks to the harassment, 3 students dropped out of the university. The case became more complicated, as their parents were rich and could get rid of any trouble, but soon after they managed to track down the killer, who turned out to be a third-year Asian girl, who was their latest victim after being brutally harassed online, decided to take revenge in the most chilling way. When the police finally tracked her down, they discovered that after killing Saeed, she had left for her hometown that same night and never returned. It hurt my soul to know that my friend had become like this, and the most shocking thing was to realize that Facebook could be used to do so much damage. Each of the 4 who were killed used to post disturbing images of their victims in the group, just as the killer did later. It was around 2 in the morning when I received a message from a Marissa. An Instagram notification popped up on my screen when I was already falling asleep, so I almost didn't pay attention to it, but the buzzing of my phone made me open one eye. When I looked, I saw that she had replied to one of my stories with a laughing emoji. That was it. I stood there, half stunned, not knowing if I should respond or not. What really caught my attention was her photo. She was posing, looking fabulous in a tight dress that highlighted her figure. She was smiling at the camera, as if she was enjoying a day at the beach. In fact, I remembered that we had coincidentally met at a beach party a few weeks ago, as she started liking all my photos. Was she trying to get my attention? I thought she was, but in the end I let it go. However, now that she wrote me, I was a little confused. How do you respond to a laughing emoji? So I replied with another emoji, not knowing what else to say. Soon after, I received an instant reply. "Don't you remember me?" he wrote. Oh, great. I kept thinking, was I supposed to? She was a really beautiful girl. I couldn't deny it. She was a little shorter in stature than mine, with a smile that lit up her oval face. She wore round glasses that looked great on her, and her dark hair with brown highlights fell gracefully over her shoulders. She had a lot of pictures on her profile, from nature images to pictures of designer shoes, but her face didn't ring a bell at all. Maybe it was because I didn't really know her. From what I remember disappearing for a few days to Las Vegas a few months ago with my friends, it probably wasn't the best environment to remember faces. Suddenly, I thought maybe Marissa must know more about me than I knew about her, so I looked up her Facebook profile, but I had no friends in common. Plus, her name was pretty common, which made things even more difficult. I traced her Instagram account looking for more clues, and that's when I noticed something very odd. Marissa had posted photos of her trip to Las Vegas right during the same time I was there. But really, you're not one of those girls you know in Vegas, are you? I wrote back. You're kidding me, she replied, but I was so confused. I checked your bio and saw you were from Denver. I replied. Marissa told me she was a law student and would be the next famous lawyer in this country. She had about 1-800 followers and was following 120 people. Her profile seemed genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been with her before. I'm sorry, but I sincerely doubt we've met, I replied. Do you remember the night of May 30th at the Omega Club? She answered in the affirmative. Oh hell, I was actually there, I told her after remembering. It was the night I went out with my friends to that club to celebrate. It's one of the most popular clubs in Las Vegas. I remember a chubby friend who was giving trouble on the dance floor, I continued, trying to shake some memory. But I failed to recall Marissa. She continued. Yes, my friend was there with my best friends, but it all worked out and we joined you. Are you sure you're not confusing me? Because I still don't remember your face, I replied, almost sultrily. Then they touched on a very touchy subject. He mentioned the mysterious death of my girlfriend. At that instant, I was shocked. How do you know that? I shouted. Even my closest friends don't know, I replied, feeling a mixture of disbelief and fear. I'm sorry, but I can't have talked about my girlfriend and I have no idea who you are, I said, feeling quite nervous now. The truth was that I moved away from my hometown 2 years ago, after the tragic death of my girlfriend Lucy, so finding her in that conversation and hearing her talk about her was more than I could handle. I was already upset. You weren't at the party and you weren't part of my group, I insisted. You owe me an explanation, I said almost aggressively. To which she replied, Listen, this is very strange to you, I know, but there's a reason why I know all this stuff. We talked before your group dispersed that night, she said, and I was floored. It can't be, I didn't know you at the time. No one can tell me what happened that night. Were you drunk and just dreamt it? Frustration began to consume my thoughts. Who was this woman and why did she know all these things when I didn't even remember her face? I was overwhelmed, so I closed my phone and dropped it on the bed. It was as if the world had fallen on me. I'm sure I hadn't met her, or she had simply been in the cavern of my memories. Yet she managed to narrate the events of that night with acute accuracy. I began to think about it, reviewing the photographs and the vestiges of my memories, but there was one disturbing detail that hovered in my mind. My girlfriend's middle name was Marissa. The phone rang again, and it was another Instagram message. I opened it, and there it was, a picture of Marissa. My stomach churned as I looked at it. It was a picture that made my head spin, and what I saw made me feel dizzy, like time stood still. He had clicked my picture just that night in front of Caesar's Hotel, and noticing the jacket, the shoes, and the same glasses took me by storm, because in one corner of his glasses, I saw my reflection. A shiver ran down my spine. It was my girlfriend, just as I left her. The same smile, with her high cheekbones and dark hair. My eyes began to fill with tears as recognition hit me full force. That was my girlfriend, whom I had buried long ago. But she used to be blonde, and clearly the big glasses wouldn't let me recognize her. I reopened all her pictures, and each image was a dagger in my heart. I had lost her. She was supposed to have taken her own life with a cocktail of pills, but here she was, right in front of me, smiling again as if nothing had happened. Suddenly another message came. I miss you so much on this side. I felt terrified, shocked. What was all this? Emma was dead, and why was she now texting me with her middle name? At that point I panicked and blocked her user. I was hyperventilating and about to have a heart attack. I lay on my back in bed and tried to forget the whole thing and fall asleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. I don't know at what point sleep overcame me, but when I woke up I couldn't help but pick up the phone again and unlock it. In the night I was dazed and confused, perhaps because of the suddenness of it all, but now I wanted answers. However, when I tried to look for her, I got a big surprise. She was gone. Her profile was gone. Our conversation was gone. Nothing. It was as if last night had never happened. To this day, I wonder if that was real or just a dream, a hallucination. I don't know, and the whole thing has broken my head so much that I just don't want to find out. Hi, I'm Liam, and what you're about to hear sounds like something out of a deep web horror story, but trust me, it's totally real, and it happened in a place we all know, Facebook. It all started one day when I decided it was time to sell my mom's old bed. It was causing her back pain, and I thought it was time to get her something new, so once I took some pictures of the old bed, I thought I'd upload them to Facebook Marketplace. I don't use that social network much, but I knew it had evolved and was now useful for finding dates, watching videos, and, of course, selling stuff. After posting the ad, a few days passed, and I noticed that questions started coming in about the bed. People wanted to know what material it was made of, or if I could lower the price a bit, but of all the comments, one especially caught my attention. A guy named Carson T. wrote to me very confidently, saying he was interested in buying it right away. He asked me where he could pick it up, so I gave him the home address. I wasn't too worried about him coming since my brothers and I would be around, so I thought everything was under control, and I really felt very fortunate to have found a buyer so quickly. However, after I sent him the address, instead of continuing the conversation, the guy suddenly stopped and didn't write anymore. Great. A jackass with no trade. The guy didn't write again and didn't show up to buy the bed either, so I forgot about it, and as the days went by, other buyers also showed interest. In fact, I sold the bed to a nice couple who wanted it for their guest room. They very kindly came, paid, and took it. But it's not them I want to talk about. It's this Carson T. Since I gave him the address, something strange started to happen. A strange car started to park across the street and spend hours there. I was sure it didn't belong to any of my neighbors, that they were two old men who wouldn't make much of a fuss. Instead, that car stayed there for up to 5 hours, but no one got in or out of it. My brothers and I thought about going over to see who was inside, but every time we looked, the tinted windows prevented us from seeing the driver. It was weird as hell, but over time we noticed a pattern. The car seemed to appear only when my mom was home, which really started to unsettle us. It wasn't long before my mom started getting messages from this Carson T. They were really weird messages telling her what he had been wearing and things he had done during the day, but the creepy thing was that he would also ask her about what she was planning to do the next day. We asked my mom who this guy was and why she had him as a friend on Facebook, and she said she didn't know him. She thought she had seen him sometime in a nearby store, but she wasn't sure. Can you imagine? As we were discussing this, something stopped my heart and almost made me scream. I looked up and saw a strange shadow watching us from the window. The window was almost closed, but there was a small space through which a pair of bloodshot eyes were watching us. Suddenly, we heard them trying to turn the latch on the window, but it was locked tight, which made the whole thing even more terrifying, because it meant someone was trying to get in. At that moment, I left the house with a knife I grabbed from the kitchen and ran to the window where the figure was, while my mom called my siblings, but when I got there, there was no one there. It was as if the person had vanished. I stood there feeling confused, but when I turned to go back, something else stopped me cold. The front door of the house slammed shut, and then I heard a scream that made my blood run cold. It was my mom. "Liam, help me!" I instantly knew someone had broken into the house. I immediately ran around the house trying to figure out who was invading us. That person had to have climbed up on the roof and entered because I had been by the door checking in the front window. I immediately tried to force the door to get in, but it was locked, so I started banging and kicking it with all my might, but it was no use. My mom's screams turned into screams of pain as I kept trying to open the door, and each blow was more desperate than the last. After several seconds, one last blow finally broke the door, but as it did, the reality around me paralyzed me. The house was completely dark. Someone had cut the electricity from inside. At that instant, I understood that this person knew our movements in every corner of the house. I was sure it was this Carson T. He had probably been researching for months, looking at the photos my mom posted on Facebook and familiarizing himself with our home. The only thing he was missing was the address, which unfortunately, I gave him. I moved forward in the dark, listening to faint moans coming from my mom's room, the place where the bed was. The moans were gradually dying down, so I had to act fast before they stopped completely. because I didn't know what was happening there. But when I finally reached the room, something blocked my way. It was someone, and he was soaking wet. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and as I realized it was my mom, and that she was covered in blood, the world came crashing down on me. Horror gripped me when I saw that her neck was open, and blood was still flowing, but she was immobile. I fell to the ground, crying in despair, hugging her body, so I barely registered what was happening around me. But suddenly something clicked in my head. If she was like this, who was making those moans I heard? The answer came in the form of a horrible man appearing out of nowhere, a gigantic monster with a large knife in his hand. I jumped up and managed to dodge him, but he stabbed me in the leg. The pain was excruciating, and when I looked at my attacker, I instantly knew it was Carson. He had no Facebook photo, but his crazy look made it clear to me who he was. So without thinking, I ran towards him, but he stopped me with a giant hand, throwing me against the wall as if I were a dummy. Carson slowly approached, enjoying every moment of my suffering, and I thought it was the end of me too. But suddenly, I heard noises at the front door. I hoped it was my brothers who were playing a game of soccer in the back street. I shouted to them, "Guys, run! There's a killer in here!" My shout brought them rushing in, and that was their worst mistake. Carson jumped out of the shadows and stabbed my younger brother in the back, who immediately fell to the ground, lifeless. My older brother tried to escape, but he couldn't adjust to the darkness in time, and before he could reach the light, Carson caught him and pushed him against the wall, leaving him stunned. I couldn't let this madman continue to annihilate my family, so dizzy as I was and losing blood, I lunged at Carson, and we began to wrestle on the ground. It was then that my brother, still in shock, saw what was happening and managed to snatch the knife from the killer and used it to stab him repeatedly until he stopped moving. The nightmare finally ended, but the loss of my mother and younger brother was devastating for us. Later, we discovered that Carson had been stalking my mom on Facebook, sending her terrifying messages from different profiles. She had decided to keep quiet, possibly so as not to worry us, but you see the consequences. Since that day, I have been forbidden to accept strangers on social networks, and the two brothers who helped me also do the same. Just know that any stranger you meet online could end up becoming your killer. I never imagined that something as everyday as Instagram could turn my life upside down. It all started one day when I decided to follow a guy named Mystery Man. He had a private account and his bio simply said curiosity, which, to be honest, intrigued me and made me itchy with curiosity. Despite my intuition telling me to be careful, I decided to send him a follow-up request, and within minutes, he accepted it. That's when I should have realized that something wasn't right, as his account didn't have a single post or follower, but I couldn't help it. I was too intrigued. Soon I started talking regularly with this mystery man. He was smart, funny, and had a very sharp sense of humor, but there was a strange air about him that made me uncomfortable. It was as if there was always something else hidden about him. Well, he lived up to his profile name. One day, he suggested we meet in person. Initially, I hesitated, but he insisted, promising that it would be harmless and that I could leave at any time if I felt uncomfortable. And after no much thought, I finally decided to meet him at a coffee shop that was close to my house. I figured that in a public place there would be no problem, and in any case, it was only a few blocks from my house, so I could even walk back. Besides, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to meet someone who could be great. So, I arrived at the place on the agreed date and saw him sitting in a corner. In person, he looked very normal, with a relaxed smile and didn't seem to have that dark halo he had on Instagram. I was able to recognize him because, after chatting a couple of times, we had exchanged photos. We talked for a while and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, so I shared my stuff with him, but he suddenly started asking me weird questions. He wanted to know my deepest fears, my childhood traumas, and even my innermost desires, something that understandably started to make me uncomfortable, and I thought maybe he would only stop if I showed that I wanted to change the subject. But no, that only got him more excited. He ignored all my signals that I was uncomfortable and distressed. and far from stopping, his conversation was getting more and more intense. At that point, I decided I'd had enough, so I told him it was time to leave. But as I stood up, he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Don't go. You have no idea what you're getting into." That was enough to make my heart soar. I shook off his grip and ran out into the street, feeling an overwhelming mix of fear and confusion. I wanted to block him on Instagram, and I should have, but I don't know why. I didn't. A few days passed, and Mystery Man started messaging me again. He apologized for scaring me and, with an almost tender tone, said he wanted to make it up to me, then told me about a surprise he had for me and asked me to meet him somewhere out of town. I don't know how, but again, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to give him another chance. Being honest, I wasn't completely immune to his appeal. He was handsome and had a charismatic air about him that made a piece of me want to move on. Yes, I know it was complete stupidity. I myself don't know what the hell was going through my head, but the fact of the matter is that I did it. When I got to where he told me, I saw him next to a car. He was dressed like some Dark James and a black leather jacket. God, he looked really handsome, and I was completely dazzled. He asked me to get in the car with him, promising me that he would take me to a mind-blowing place, and I did so without hesitation. But as soon as I sat down, he locked the locks and sped off. At that point, I yelled for him to stop, but he just laughed and said, "Relax, we're just going to have a little adventure." Then I knew I was in serious trouble because something told me that this little fling was no good. "Sir, what had he done?" He drove for what seemed like an eternity until we arrived at an old abandoned mansion. He opened the door for me, took me by the hand, perhaps more firmly than he should have, and led me to explore the place. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind kept thinking about everything that could go wrong in that abandoned place in the middle of nowhere. But I didn't want to make things tense. After all, I was already there, and if I got rough, things were going to get worse. Of that I was sure. But keeping calm when my heart wanted to come out of my mouth was something easier said than done. As we were watching, I began to hear strange noises coming from one of the rooms. As if reading my mind, he led me over there to see what was there, and to my horror, I found a group of girls no more than 16 years old, huddled in a corner crying. I immediately asked them what was going on, and he just laughed and replied, "Don't worry, they're just part of my collection." At that moment, I knew I was trapped in the worst nightmare of my life. This guy was not only weird, he was a psychopath, and I had to escape from there as fast as possible. My eyes filled with tears, but I refused to let them fall, so I tried to run away, but he caught me and dragged me back into the room, where he locked the door. "You're not going anywhere. You're part of my collection now," he told me with a crazed grin. And so I was trapped with the others, with almost no food or water, in a dark, cold room. I was completely desperate. This guy came in every day and did things to us that I don't even want to remember. The hours turned into days and everything was a complete nightmare. But I started to relate to the other girls, knowing that it was the only way to survive, although we were not very clear how. However, as the days went by, we were so bad, I thought it was all over, but I knew we couldn't give up. So we started to think of ways to get out of that place any way we could. One day, while our jailer was outside, we realized that there was a window that let some light in. So we took advantage of that time gap to, among all of us, try to break it, and fortunately we succeeded. But my companions were so weak that it was impossible for them to jump through it. So the option was for me, who had less time there and were in better shape, to go out and look for help. As soon as I got through the small slot in the window, I ran out as fast as I could until I reached an old road where not a soul was passing by. I was so exhausted and dehydrated that I felt I would die before I could get help. But just when I thought I was totally lost, a random car appeared. The occupants of that vehicle were a group of guys who seemed to have come from hiking, and upon seeing me, they seemed to be as confused as I was by everything that had happened the previous days. At first I wasn't sure about accepting their help, but in the end I decided to take a chance because I had no other choice. Finally, they took me to a police station and I told them everything I had experienced. Shocked, the cops decided to go with me back to the mansion where it all happened, and upon investigating, they discovered that this weird man had been using Instagram to lure girls into his trap. It turned out that he had been at this game for years, preying on innocent victims, keeping them locked up and abusing them until they eventually died of starvation and thirst. In other words, the teenage girls he had been with in the abandoned mansion, and myself, were only a small part of those he had trapped. At that moment, I realized the magnitude of his cruelty, and that there were many more like us who had suffered, and who unfortunately had no chance to escape. The policemen released the girls and took us all to the hospital for treatment. There were 7 of us in total, but 5 were in critical condition, almost on the verge of death. They also collected as much evidence as possible and began the search for the guy, but he always seemed to get away. Fear accompanied me everywhere after that, knowing that if he ever decided to show up again, my life would no longer have peace. However, weeks later, fate finally took a turn in my favor. They managed to track him down through another Instagram account he was using and arrested him. The infelish was sentenced to death, and while this brought some closure to the victims and their families, his story is a reminder that there are evil people in the world who don't think twice about harming others. I am still haunted by nightmares about that experience. I can never forget how we stood there, filled with fear, as we listened to the laughter of that torturing man. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to trust someone I met on the internet. Since then, I have been more cautious, but my curiosity always tries to get the better of me. I learned a hard lesson, and I carry it with me forever.